What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode. And before I get into today's episode, I just wanted to quickly mention the great event that we had. It was an in-person event just a few days ago, on the 5th of October. It's basically like a quarterly event that I do, and it's for the members of the mastermind and the accelerator. And what I normally do is book a hotel, conference room, and we'll get a lot of members together for a bit of networking, usually a guest speaker, and also we do a bit of a lunch, and so it's a bit of fun. We did it on the 5th of October, and I had a guest speaker. I had Christina Ravich, who incidentally was also my guest back in episode number 174 of the podcast. And Christina gave a great talk on her journey as a property investor and also as a professional building surveyor. And so for the guys that all attended, they got some great tips from Christina on what to look for when buying property, how to recognize, for example, dry rot. And she also pointed out some of the warning signs that would suggest that maybe you have asbestos. And also a couple of tips around when you see a certain type of thing. She highlighted a couple of things which were basically like a no-go. If you are in a property and you notice something like this, then that's it. Just walk away from the property, because it's like it could potentially be a bottomless pit of money to go and rectify those problems. So anyway, great event. There was about 21 people at it. And I actually think I'm going to have to get a bigger room for the next event. The upcoming event is going to be in February. And as I have said before a few times, I just like to suggest to you guys, if you would like to join the accelerator, if you'd like to be mentored by me on property investment, how to scale your property portfolio, things like raising money, how to structure a deal, what to look for, and all that kind of stuff, then the accelerator, it's not too late to actually join the October intake. I'm running the intake until the end of the month, and so please do reach out. I'll leave a link to the program overview in the show notes, so you can click on that, watch the video that explains the whole program, and then there is, if you think you'd be suitable, then there's kind of an application questionnaire, and you go and fill out a couple of details, and I'll get back to you. We'll have a call. Anyway, this week is a busy one. I'm off to Bristol on Wednesday. I'm speaking at an event on high performance. And I normally do my mastermind calls on a Wednesday. And in fact, last Wednesday, we were on a mastermind call, and Zofhia from KRA, which is the organization that Christina Ravich, who was our guest speaker, KRA, they have a sustainability division. And Zofhia looks after that. And she's one of the members in the mastermind. And she was giving us an overview of the national retrofit plan. So we spent about an hour talking about how to go about getting SEAI grants in order to fund the retrofit of your property. And the retrofit of your property meaning like to bring it from a BER rating of, say, whatever it might be, a low BER up to a B2 BER. And it's possible to do this and to get grants up to, I think, 50,000 or something like that. And so, after the mastermind, I got some messages from the guys in the group, and they just said that that was really useful information and that it would make for a great episode. And so here we are on the episode. I thought I may as well strike while the iron is hot. I have a fair bit of information from that talk, and I thought I'll go and explain to you guys exactly how to go about doing this. And so I guess the title that I'm going to give this podcast is going to be, unlocking energy efficiency, and what is the national retrofit plan for Ireland, and how do you go about getting the grants that the SEAI offer in order to upgrade your home. And there's various steps. Zofhia was explaining how all of that works and why it matters, and some of the issues that she has noticed that in the process of going about doing this. And so I thought, let's go and put it together and let's have a conversation about this. So first of all, let's get into the national retrofit plan. Like, what is it? And I've talked about this before some time back, but just in case you need a bit of a refresher, The government announced a little while back that 500,000 homes are going to be retrofitted, or certainly that's the plan that they have. And the idea here is that by 2030, 500,000 homes will be brought up to a B2 standard, that is the BER rating. And if you're not familiar with a BER rating, it's your building energy rating, and it is basically a measure of the performance of your property as a as it pertains to energy efficiency. How much fuel do you burn through? How often do you have to turn on your central heating in order to keep the house warm? If you're anyone who lives in an old house, like over the years I've owned lots of different types of houses. Probably the oldest one I bought was kind of 1840s or something like that. And those houses have very, very poor insulation standards. In fact, they effectively have no insulation standards. And they often had single glazed sash windows. And so all of that stuff, and big, big fireplaces. And so when you're in a house like that, it's extremely difficult to heat. And because it's extremely difficult to heat, you have to spend a lot of money. You have to have the heating on like nearly full time during the winter time. And that's not to make it nice and warm. That's just to kind of keep it habitable because it gets so cold. And I was explaining to, I met some friends yesterday for coffee, and we were chatting about an old house that I stayed in, an old period house years and years ago when I was like in my early or in my late teens or maybe early 20s. And this old period house was a guest house, and I was staying there, and I can remember getting into the bed and pulling back the covers, and it was like lying down on a block of ice. That's what the bed felt like. It was that cold. And despite the fact that there was a fire in the room and everything like that, it was just like ice. And nobody, enjoys that, but people do get used to it. And if you're living in a house like that, you go to bed basically wearing, woolly pajamas, and you have to kind of just get used to that kind of lifestyle. But nowadays, people are getting used to, the house that I'm living in now in Shankill is A1, which is the highest rating you can get. Now, I have no illusions. I know that 10 years from now, the ratings are probably going to be reset, and I'll probably be living in a house that has a C rating. But right now, today, it's the highest you can get. That's an A1. And there's a lot of benefits to this. And one of the reasons why I bring it up is because you might be asking yourself, like, why would I go and spend money on doing up my property if I'm an investor? Like, if I'm not living there myself and I'm not the one who's benefiting from these improvements, then why would I bother spending all that money? And I'll explain one of the reasons why I believe it's important. And first of all, like, the government has made all these commitments to the EU, and the EU can actually fine us in 2030 if we don't meet this. And the commitment is to bring our energy consumption or our carbon emissions in the country down by 51% by 2030 from, I think it was 2021 when the national plan went out. And if you go and look at the UK market as an example, what the UK market did, and they were very ambitious as well, they embarked on these similar kind of improvements in their emissions. They wanted to be, able to sort of show that they were leading the market and all this kind of stuff. And they announced in 2021 as well that all rental property, all tenancies had to be a minimum of a BER rating of a C by 2025. Now, prior to this, the minimum was an E rating. Now, anyone who has an old house, it's probably going to be an E or an F or something like that. Like if you go into the really, really old houses, it's like a G. And if it gets that bad, then it's often exempt, because it would be impossible to bring the house up to a standard without replacing windows, which might be, heritage windows and things like that. Like you can't go and rip out original windows in a listed building to put in double glazed. You have to keep a lot of the stuff in its original format. And so it's because of these rules that some of these things are exempt. But in the UK, and the UK doesn't call it the BER, they call it the EPC, but it's exactly the same thing, the Energy Performance Certificate, I think it is. And it's the very same. So over there's an A. Here in Ireland, it's an A1, A2, and A3. And you can kind of, depending on what level you get, you go up through the ranks. But in the UK, it's just A. And then there's a B rating, which is similar. We have the B1, B2, B3, and so on, so forth. But what happened was they brought in this rule that all tenancies had to be to a minimum of a C. And that meant that if you were a landlord who owned a property that was coming in at a level D, then your property was no longer allowed to be rented out. And so you could live in it yourself, but you could not rent it out. And so suddenly there was this time clock. By 2025, if you want to rent this property, it must be a minimum of an EPC of C. And the responsibility was the landlords. And now they did, from what I understand, they said that there was a cap. So you could spend up to 10,000 doing this, £10,000. You weren't required to spend beyond that number. But the problem is that 10,000 won't go very far if you're trying to bring a house up to a certain standard. And certainly here in the Irish market, we know that. Like a lot of people, it's likely to cost you 50, 60, 70,000 to do the kind of work that we're talking about here. And the grants don't always add up to that. But what happened in the UK anyway, just to finish that story, is 2023, I can remember the day it happened because we were on a mastermind call when it happened, is they announced that they were postponing this. And there was a couple of reasons why they did this. But if you remember, we came out of COVID and there was sudden rush of inflation. And to make matters worse, England were coming out of, were enduring the post-Brexit situation. And in addition to that, there was the Liz Truss government had kind of screwed up and interest rates went shooting up overnight. And all of a sudden, everyone, like the cost of living, the cost of your mortgage, the cost of everything had all just shot up very, very quickly. And so there was this landlord backlash going on. And there was also concerns that if we impose all this stuff and people, because of interest rates going up and the cost of living going up and all that, people are not going to do the work. And therefore, the properties are not going to be on the market. And therefore, we're going to have a housing supply issue. And so all of this kind of came together. And in the end, the UK government decided in 23, you know what? This is not actually a good time to do this, so we're postponing. So we're lifting the 2025 deadline and pushing it out. Now, the reality is 2030, there is still a deadline. And whether the UK is going to try to force it through, we'll have to see, because now that they've gone through Brexit, the likelihood is there is no fines that the EU can impose on them. But here in Ireland, we actually are going to be fined if we miss these commitments. And this is why the government announced the retrofit plan. And the retrofit plan, it really is quite ambitious. But ambitious, you got to kind of wonder whether or not it was a little bit foolhardy, actually, rather than being entirely ambitious. When you're looking at what's involved, 500,000 properties. And at the moment, I understand that from the figures that I was looking at, 2023, 36,000 houses were retrofitted. And so you still have about 460,000 to go in 2024 with 6 years left. So do the maths on that. That's somewhere between 60 and 70,000 houses have got to be retrofitted every single year for the next couple of years. Can that be achieved? Like we already have, if anyone's trying to get work done at the moment, if you're trying to get the construction work done or anything like that, you know that contractors are flat out. So you have to, I question whether or not there's going to be enough manpower to actually do this number of properties. And also whether there's going to be enough money around to do it. So all of this stems from Ireland's obligations under the EU Green Deal and the Paris Agreement. And we came out, following all of those things, we came out with the National Climate Action Plan. But there's also other side that we've got energy security. Ireland has a lot of dependence on imported fossil fuels. If you consider, we don't have any apart from the wind turbines off the coast and our hydroelectric power stations, most of our energy comes in the form of gas, and it comes from these big interconnectors. And so we are importing fossil fuel, we're importing coal, we're importing oil we're importing, gas, all of this stuff is coming in. And for our own national security, you have to start thinking about, like, since the Russia-Ukraine war kicked off, all of a sudden Russia is banned, and all of a sudden there's a bit of an issue in getting access to fossil fuels. And so why do we want to be using as much fossil fuels as we were? If we could reduce that by 50%, not only is there going to be a benefit to climate change, but there's also going to be a benefit to our state pocket. Everyone will be spending less. So that is a benefit. In addition to that, the National Retrofit Plan aims to add about 20,000 new jobs to the construction sector. So that is a good thing. And at the same time, fostering green innovation in Ireland. And of course, when there is 500,000 properties being done up, then all of a sudden new businesses can start. And I know one of my clients that did the accelerator a couple of years back, herself and her husband started a solar panel business, and they put solar panels on roofs, and I reached out to her recently to find out how they're doing, and it's going better than planned. So it just shows you that these things do have a trickle down effect, and the guys that are starting business and stuff are benefiting. So it is good. The SEAI, what is it? So the SEAI stands for the Sustainable Energy Association of Ireland, I think it is. And it's the national body that basically promotes energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainable living in Ireland. And the key functions are to manage the retrofit grants, to support renewable energy initiatives, to provide expert advice and education, and then the actual administering of grants for electric vehicles and other energy saving projects. And the importance of this to homeowners or to property investors is that the SEAI supports you in making energy upgrades to your home, makes them more affordable, but in the form of grants and advice, and there's accessible programs. And so this is some of the stuff that we went through on our call the other evening when we were talking about all this. We were talking about the process on how you go about it. And there is a step-by-step process. But the thing to be aware of, and this is one of the, I suppose, the drawbacks of it, is that they say that they cover about, say 50% of the cost. And if you're going to go and do a load of work to your house, and you'd be thinking you can get up to, I think, 35,000 of the cost back. And if you were spending, say, 70,000, that represents about 50,000. The problem is that most of the time when you're doing work on a property, it will often be additional work that you'll do. You're not simply going to sort of put solar panels on the roof and improve the insulation. Usually, if you're getting people in and they're kind of doing work, a lot of the time you're going to go and get them to do additional work. And they only cover the basic costs. They only cover 50% of the actual upgrades, not all of the additional stuff. So if you've got architects involved in plans and all this kind of stuff, a lot of that stuff won't get covered. So you might end up spending, say, 100,000 on the project, but you'll only get 35,000 of that covered. And so that's the first thing. If you're going to go about doing this, there are steps that you need to take. And so the SEAI retrofit grant, there's a step-by-step process. First of all, you want to check your eligibility. Like, are you actually eligible to get these grants in the first place? And there's various things you must do if you have any chance to get them. And if you don't follow these, you're not going to get them, and you're going to have spent the money, and then you're going to realize that you're disappointed now. You're not going to get this. The first thing is the age of the property. The property must be, I think, 2011, must be before pre-2011. That's the first thing. And the current BER rating has to be lower. And also, there's certain schemes will have income level. They'll have kind of like a grant, if what your income, what your earning potential is and stuff like that. You need to decide on the upgrades themselves. Like, are you going for shallow or deep retrofit? And it's all down to the type of home that you're in. Sometimes, small amount of work can be done where really all you're doing is putting in, say, additional insulation. But sometimes it's quite considerable amount of work. For example, you can do external cladding that has insulation standards, and that external insulation goes on the outside. So it's not that invasive in terms of going in and having to do all of your walls and stuff. And maybe that means having to move light switches and reshape doors and all that. Like that stuff can be kind of easier. But if you're going in, for example, one of the things that people tend not to do, but is possible, is to insulate your ground floor slab. And I know from building these houses that when we put in the insulation, I think it was 175 mil thick, which is a big block of insulation, very, very thick. Most old houses don't have that. I don't even have it close to that. It might be 50 mil. And so if you wanted to go, and it means that a lot of heat is lost through the floor. If you wanted to upgrade your home and put in a much thicker insulation, it obviously means that you're going to lift the floor, the concrete floor of your ground floor. And that's going to have an impact on doors. It's going to have an impact on any kind of stairs that there are, because the lowest step is now going to be kind of like shrunk. So there's a lot of things like that you need to think about. So thinking about the various sort of ways of going about it, there's the step-by-step process. Your BER assessment, you need to go and get a BER assessment. And we've found, you can obviously just look up the phone book or look up online, and somebody will come out to your house and they'll go through it. I found that I'm a little bit disappointed in the way that some assessors do their job. I have found that when we bring them in to do an assessment of one of our buildings, say in East Point, we'll ask the guy to go and do the thing, and they'll go through this checklist. It's like on an iPad, and they're just like ticking boxes, and it spits out a figure, and they'll say, okay, that's a D rating or whatever. But if they were to actually do a little bit more homework, and if they were to put in the specific details rather than just choosing like default settings that are in their iPad, you would get a better rating. So we've done as an example, we've done an exercise where one of the older buildings was coming in at a D, and that's what the guy gave us, this thing. But when we actually went through this whole process, and when we sort of used the stats for the window products that we were using and various things like that, it actually came in at a higher level. And suddenly you realize, it looks very, very bad if your building is coming in at a D. It looks good if it's coming in at a B. And sometimes it could be the difference between a C and a D, for example, just be down to whether a guy decides to use default readings rather than actually lifting up the phone and calling the landlord and saying, like, what kind of light fittings have you installed there? Can you give me the specific type? And if you give me the specific type, I can tell you what the energy rating is, rather than if you don't have that information, they just click a button and it'll just be like some standard figure, and then you don't get the benefits of maybe you've got a better figure than that. Anyway, you get your BER assessment, and I think you can actually claim back some of the cost of that as well. And then what's really, really important, and this is the most important thing, you must use an SEAI registered contractor. You cannot do any of this work using just any contractor. The person must be registered with the SEAI. And if that's first of all for quality and stuff like that. But if you were to use somebody that is not registered, and then you come back and apply for all of this, and that comes out to be, that person's not registered, that's it. You've lost your claim. That's cost you maybe 35 grand. And so very important. Now, having said that, one of the things that came up when we were speaking the other night was that there is so much work involved in the paperwork that a lot of people, a lot of contractors are actually pulling out of registration because it's so hasslesome for them to submit all the paperwork and actually be there. And so they're deciding like that it's not actually worth the hassle, and they're pulling out of it for that reason. So that's something. In terms of the grant measures, like some of the stuff that you'll actually get back, you can put in a heat pump and you'll get that like the cost of that, or certainly some of the cost of that back. Heating controls, solar panels or PV cells on your roof, the insulation that you put in either on your walls or into your roof space. Floor insulation will also be covered, but as I mentioned, that's quite a big amount of work. All of that stuff must be done by a contractor that is registered. Now, there's additional stuff that you can do that doesn't have to be done by a registered contractor, and that is windows and doors. That can be done by anybody, and I know there's a lot of different people out there that do that kind of thing. And also you can get a thing called an airtightness test. Now, this is something that I've actually done a couple of times in our buildings, and it makes such a difference in a large office building, possibly not such a big difference in a residential scenario. But what I found, and this was really instrumental in us getting our energy rating to a much higher level. We were doing one of our buildings, and the default reading for a building is, I think it's 25 or something like that. And so if you were to bring in a BER assessor and they were to say, okay, what kind of cladding is on the building? And you would say it's, aluminium glazing facade system. And that comes with this standard 25 reading. And that's the default setting. So he'll just click the button, and you've scored 25, which is quite a poor rating. Instead, what we did is we brought in these guys, and they went and they did an air tightness test. And what they go in, they close up every single window, and they seal up all of the vents, and they go around doing everything is closed. So the system is completely sealed up. And then what they do is they pump the building full of air, and they take a reading on how quickly that air pressure drops. And that way they can tell how much leakage of air is in your building. And that might be through, poor seals in the windows, or it might be underneath the doors. There's, gaps. And so the air just flows out through the gaps in the doors and stuff. And after we did this process, they came back. It cost a couple of grand to do this, but they came back and they gave us our reading, and our reading came in at something like 6.7. And to go from 25 down to 6, that was the difference that got us up to a B2 reading. Whereas prior to that, we were below that. I think we were probably around a C or something like that. And so this made a massive difference to our BER rating, just because we carried out the air tightness test. So worth considering that. Now, what else can we talk about in terms of this? There's an online system that you have to apply for this. Now, it's the SEAI portal. And this is kind of like there's a one-stop shop service as well. But what you do is you go in there and you make all this kind of, you put in all these kind of readings and the various things like that. And I know that this can be confusing for some people, so you might want to get help. And I know that companies like KRA Sustainables that Zofhia works for, that she runs, they do that kind of stuff. And so it's definitely worth maybe reaching out to guys like that. The next thing though is carry out the work. Like, you have to go ahead and do the work. This is one of the problems with this system, is that you're expected to fund the entire thing yourself. And then after the work is complete, then you apply for a recovery of the grant. And so I think that, in my opinion, is a real drawback of the scheme. I suppose from a practical standpoint, it's probably not surprising, and it's probably unlikely that it could be done, administered any other way. But if you really want to make an impact on people and sort of like encourage them to do this, then it should be something that is a little bit easier than that you should be able to get access. Now, I understand that there's money available, so you can actually get some sort of a loan, and it's a kind of a low cost loan. So at least that's something. But you can imagine, like, for a lot of people, coming up with 50, 60, 70,000 is not an easy task. And therefore there's this, this is the difficulty, and this is the friction that prevents the market from happening. And one of the concerns I have, like, they're talking about 8 billion being allocated to kind of help with this cost. And you might think to yourself, whoa, 8 billion, that's an incredible sum of money. But is it really? I mean, it's a large sum of money, but if you divide it over the number of properties that are involved, it doesn't look so impressive. And so I'm just looking at it here, 8 billion divided by 500,000, it comes in at 16,000 per house. So 16,000 is not going to get you the vast majority of houses up to the standard that they need to be. And so it means that you have to put your hand in your own pocket for, at minimum, the other 16, but the likelihood is it'll actually be probably a greater sum than that. And so I think that is a bit of a drawback. And because of that, I don't have any confirmation of this, but I suspect something a little bit like what happened in the UK is going to be introduced here in order to ramp up the amount of people that are doing this. And it'll be some kind of incentive scheme on one hand and some sort of penalty scheme on the other hand. And what they could do is something like, in the event that your house is a B2 or higher, that your property tax is reduced or eliminated, we'll say. And in the event that you haven't done the work and your house is an inefficient house, then you'll have to pay maybe an additional bit of property tax or something like that. That would be certainly a real carrot and stick approach that would suddenly get people going, hey, I got to go and do this pretty quickly. The other thing is ultimately, like, at the end of the day, it's costing you less to run the property in terms of fuel bills and things like that. Now, if you're renting to somebody else, then maybe that doesn't matter to you. But if you're a person, like last week, I did the HMO episode 222, and this is episode 223. In episode 222, we talked about the HMO, and one of the things I mentioned is that the landlord takes on all those bills. And if you're a landlord taking on all those bills, then these bills can be quite substantial. And so doing up your property is going to have a material impact on the amount of fuel that you're spending every quarter or every month or whatever. So that could be beneficial. But something that Zofhia said that's actually important to bring out is that the heat pump. So people are being encouraged to replace gas central heating and oil central heating, which is being basically outlawed over the next couple of years. You have to replace those things with a heat pump if you want to get your BER up to a higher standard. And I have a heat pump here in this house, and it works fine. I don't have a problem with it, although I have heard people talking about that they're not great. Like there is some complaints about them. But a heat pump is going to cost you a bit of money to go and install that. So that's something to consider. And the cost of a heat pump is actually not just the outlay, but there's an energy cost as well. Like when you put in a heat pump, it is running off of electricity. And so the electricity bills may incrementally increase, whereas your gas bill will drop away to zero. So it's not kind of like free lunch to a degree. Anyway, there's various grants. The SEAI obviously pays out these things, but there's other grants as well, just to be aware of. There's the Home Energy Grant, and that covers insulation, the heat pump we talked about, and the solar panels. There's also a Better Energy Warmer Home scheme. Now, this is aimed at low-income households, where they will fully fund everything, and that's partly because there's a concern about energy. What is it that they call it? Energy poverty. Sorry, I forgot about that. But yeah, energy poverty is a big issue, and they're trying to just reduce that as a problem. And like low fuel poverty, I think it's called. It's a key pillar to addressing that, because improved insulation and heating systems brings down the bills, and it's the bills when you are in a low income sort of household, then these bills that you're paying are actually a greater amount of your income than the average person that's earning a higher wage. And so it represents a significant amount of your income. And so if you are living in an old house and it's costing you a fortune to heat it, a lot of people will actually decide, I'm going to eat rather than pay these bills. And so they might just not use the heat, and so they're constantly in freezing cold temperatures and going around with 3 or 4 jumpers on or whatever it is. And so that's not an ideal situation, obviously, for somebody to live and have children and things like that. So this is something that they're trying to address. And then there's the Receive Grant Approval. So the SEAI, they will review your application, and if it's approved, you'll receive a grant offer. And it's only after the approval that you actually can start the work. So this is another thing that is it adds all this friction. You must use a contractor that is registered. And so you bring in your contractor, you agree everything, and then you actually have to submit your application, and you have to get it approved before you start the work. Then when the thing has been approved, you pay for all of this yourself, and then after it's finished, they'll give you the grant once they've confirmed that all of these works were done by the registered contractor. So you can see, like, getting your hands on the money is obviously attractive, but there's quite a few hoops that you have to jump through in order to get there. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what's involved in that process. And in order to get your grant, you have to submit all the paperwork, you have to submit all the invoices, and you also have to actually prove that you paid these invoices. And so they're actually looking for the invoice, and they're looking for the matching bank statement showing the outgoing payment. And so, it's quite a process. And so be aware that you don't just tick a box and the money arrives in your bank account. Anyway, then there's a community energy grant, and that is more for a community-based project. And then there's the one-stop shop service. That is for managing deep retrofits and when there's multiple upgrades involved. One of the things they said as a tip for successful application is make sure you apply well in advance. So there's a high demand on all this stuff, and so there's quite a process to get a response. And also get multiple quotes from registered contractors. And that goes for any contractor. If you're asking contractors to do an extension or a house, improvement scheme or anything like that, you should always go out and get a couple of prices. And it's funny, we've always the prices can range quite substantially. And the way we kind of talk about this is that if you get a really, really keen price, that is that's a price that somebody wants the job and they're really trying to get the job. And then you'll often get a price that is so much higher, it's thousands above, and you kind of automatically know that, well, that contractor is busy and they just don't want the work. So this is a PFO, and you know what that acronym means, PFO. It's basically okay, look, here's a price, but we don't expect you to accept it because it's going to be an F off kind of a price. And one of the other things is the grant amounts, they don't match the funding. The amount that you're going to get is not going to be the amount that you're going to spend. So just bear that in mind again. It's important to remember that you're not going to get the full price back. So you do have to put your hand in your own pocket. Even though there are benefits there. Now, one of the things that I've been saying to the clients in the accelerator that's very important to remember is that the banks are now starting to insist that your property is upgraded to B2. We're seeing it in the commercial portfolio, and it's not that it has to be done today, but there has to be a roadmap in place for this work to be done at some stage in the near future. And what is guaranteed is that by 2030, if your properties are not at a B2 level, then you will not get a loan from a bank. The banks are all insisting that their loan books have been sanitized and that they'll have all B2 kind of properties sitting in their loan books. Now, the only exception to that will be where they've gone and entered into a 25-year mortgage with somebody and there's 20 years to go or something like that. That will probably be different. But it's worth your while looking at this, because I've noticed a mortgage, if you have an A1 or an A2 rated property, you're probably paying 0.5% less. And that might even have changed since I last looked, but that's what it was when I looked. They had two rates, one for an A1 or an A2 rated property, and then the rates that everyone else pays for. So that it will actually help you from an energy cost saving and from an interest rate saving point of view. Some of the benefits, you've got the highlighting, the insulation and the heating and all that kind of stuff. It's much, much healthier being in a house that actually has decent level of heating, because if the house is warm, you have a tendency to open the window and let the fresh air in. If you don't have a warm house, the likelihood is you'll have the windows will be shut all the time because it's just too cold. And so it's from a point of view of mold and things like that, this can be a problem. And that definitely, mold can have a serious impact on your health. And I don't think people are aware of this. But I know somebody I was following this person, and he didn't realize it was mold related, but they had had a flood in their building and the elevator shaft had filled with water. And he lived across from this elevator shaft. And of course, the doors in the lift open and close every day. You don't know that there's all this mold in the shaft itself, which is out of sight. And this mold is directly, across from his door. And so every day he was coming and going, and he was in this area with all of this mold very close to where he was. And it had an impact on his brain, and it basically triggered this some sort of a reaction in his brain where he was suddenly basically a little bit like being in this alert stage, like something bad is about to happen to you. So this kind of anxiety came over him, and it was like he was waiting for the house to be broken into at any moment. That kind of anxiety. And he had never had this problem before, and then suddenly at night couldn't sleep, was constantly like alert. His brain was firing 1,000 times a second, and he was just, and he said this went on for months, and he said he was actually suicidal by the end of it, because when you haven't slept for months, you can't function in work. Everything started to go to hell. And he was going to see doctors. He was going to all this treatment trying to figure out. And they didn't know that it was the mold. And he met this lady by chance, and I think it was in the pharmacy or something like that. And he was describing his symptoms to the pharmacy, and the lady overheard him and said, "Sorry, have you got this problem?" And he said, "Yeah." And she says, "Those are my symptoms too. You've got a mold problem." And they went and they got people to come and investigate it, and they discovered the mold in the elevator shaft. And within a couple of days of that, his symptoms subsided. He moved into another place, and immediately the symptoms started to subside. And so just shows you what a bit of mold can do if you're living in a house that has poor ventilation, and if it's very damp and it's got a lot of problems and stuff like that. So in terms of my views on this 500,000 properties, the government, it might be like a great idea to go and do this from an environmental point of view, and the fact that we have these commitments and stuff like that. But I do question just the current housing market the way it is, the acute situation that we're in terms of housing. I just wonder, is this not diverting labor and tradespeople away from building houses and focusing on retrofit? Now, it might be that these are completely different skill sets, and that's fair enough, but I would imagine that if you're able to go and earn money doing insulation in roofs and all that kind of stuff, then you'll probably go after that rather than be building a house and maybe have to kind of bid on a job, and maybe it's not as lucrative because you don't have the person getting grants to help support the project. So I don't know. I'm curious what you guys think. How many of you out there are actively thinking about the retrofit of your property? And if you have done it, what kind of money have you spent on it? It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts and your views on it. So let me know if you want to leave a comment down below, or send me a DM or whatever like that. It'd be great to hear from you. I hope you found this one useful, guys. Remember, the accelerator open for business. Not too late to join the October intake. We've had a couple of guys join in the last couple of days, and really trying to get a couple more in there, because it's always nice to have a little group of people starting around the same time. So, guys, hope you found this one useful. Look forward to seeing you next week.